lunch. South Africa's May reserves figures have been released, and in May the gross reserves in this country dipped to 48.1 billion US dollars from 50.3 billion in April, and it says here that's due to a scheduled repayment of a foreign loan by government of 1.3 billion euros, revaluation effects, it says, it goes on to say, due to rand depreciation, and also a decline in the gold price. Net reserves eased to 45.4 billion US dollars from 45.83 billion. Does it all matter? I don't know. Let's find out from Chris Hart, who's the Chief Strategist at Investment Solutions. He's in the Power Lunch Johannesburg studio. Before we get into this, Chris, you're a great historian of reserves. Go back to when Chris Stals was the South African Reserve Bank governor. How many minuses did we have in those days? I mean, we were really in trouble, I think.
We were in trouble in the sense that we'd sort of emerged from sanctions where the balance of payments were a little bit under pressure. The current account had swung into deficit, and really the opportunity to build up reserves had been fairly limited. Certainly South Africa was way below what other countries would be, and we still are, in fact. And we often compared against that, but usually the rough rule of thumb is that you should have reserves of around about 3 months of imports, and that is the minimum sort of benchmark, and South Africa has that. I don't think we need to worry about that. My concern is that while we've built up reserves over the past several years, we've stopped doing so, and I'm pleased about that for no other reason is that building up reserves usually means buying dollars, which I've got a problem with. I think when the custodian of the dollars, which is the Federal Reserve, are printing money, and the US is running a twin deficit, etc., it does mean the assets that we're buying, which is effectively US treasuries, is in fact being debased. And we as a society have to pay for that. In addition to that, we have to do it at a loss. So when we say building up reserves, that sounds okay, but effectively what it is also on the other side of that same coin is that South Africa is busy effectively funding and subsidizing the US government at a loss to ourselves. And it's always a question, should we be funding the US government, or should we be buying schools, hospitals and roads with that money? It's a debate one has, but I certainly would prefer schools, hospitals and roads.
But on the other hand, Chris, let's say that we didn't build up reserves, we didn't fund the US government, albeit in a very, very small way compared to somewhere like China or Japan, which are massive, massive buyers of US treasuries. When we got down to zero reserves and zero import cover, some hedge fund, some smart hedge fund trader in the offices of Mayfair in London would suddenly say, let's have a go at the South African rand. There's no defence there whatsoever, and the rand would go immediately to 12. Exactly,
and so people look at that as a risk factor, and so clearly there is a role for reserves. So I'm never advocating that we shouldn't have reserves, but in my view is that by building reserves up in dollars is that we're supporting the US, whereas if we built up reserves in gold, we're supporting ourselves, and I think that makes far more sense. It is at a loss, but reserves are meant to be at there for a rainy day. You can always convert gold into dollars, but it's not always clear that you can convert dollars into gold. And so it's certainly a better quality reserve that we'd have, and certainly would be something that would help to support our own industries. Our reserves have dropped most since 2008. If you look on your screen now, the rand is 9.99 in England, the country of my birth. When you want to call the police, you phone 999. Should we be calling the police? I suspect that if I were to be particularly naughty, the answer is absolutely. There's plenty of people that we could get the hawks after. But unfortunately, it's really something that we need to look at internally. A lot of the reasons for the weakness has been internal, because the rand has been weakening over the past 6 to 8 months during what we call as a risk-on period. In other words, it's a time capital flows are looking for risky assets. It's a time that South Africa should have actually seen, and we have seen it, but our huge big negative deficits have been overwhelming the actual inward flows, and we've been weakening during that risk-on period. If we could just flip over even if it's to a 1 or 2 months risk off period, the rand could actually jump quite a bit, in that thing. And it's only at that point, I'd say, we're then overcooked. The traders would say we're overcooked in the short term, and I would agree with that. But I don't think we've seen the last of this particular move, because the risk on trade globally has actually, you could say, gone past its sell-by date. It's in desperate need of some sort of pullback and consolidation.
There was a 1.3 billion loan repayment. That's a euro loan repayment, Chris. Yes. But what about the flows out of bond funds, and therefore the concomitant flows out of the South African rand? Do you think that this number that we've seen, the worst for 5 years, could be continued in June, July, August and beyond?
No, not necessarily, because I think Kimon earlier alluded to that as well, is that when the rand starts to get particularly cheap, right, and our yields have kicked up enough, in this world where you have zero yield in Europe, and you've got sovereign solvency problems, and you've got growth problems, South Africa starts to look so attractive as an investment destination, because we might not have a lot of growth, but we do have there is a bit of growth. We might, to us our yields are low, but to them our yields are absolutely mouth-watering compared to what's available there. And the country is solvent. And that is such a difference to what's happening in Europe, or the situation you find yourself in Europe. And they, in fact, de facto position of the US, UK and Japan, they're also technically solvent, but they can print money to actually hide that. And this is where I believe South Africa is in a strong position, and the reason we find ourselves with the rand over 10 is internal more than external. The external conditions are in fact rand supportive more than anything else.
Chris, we're going to have to cut that short there, because I've got one question to ask you, which is not to do with the reserves, but will have something to do with reserves in the future, because it's going to affect the world's economies and the world's markets. The non-farm payrolls number, I say 105,000. Oh, sorry, I say 87,000 new jobs created. Kimon Bianti's 105,000. Yes. You can join the lunch party here. What's your estimate?
My estimate would also be around about 100,000, and a lot of that will be due to the birth-death model that'll pick up effectively a shift there. So in other words, a lot of the jobs created will be really how could you say, statistical.
The lunch will not be dependent on your rationale. It's just the 100,000 number that I need, Chris. Thanks very much.